Woo! That's right. All right, my name is Dane Laughlin. I'm the lead for the enterprise track for today. It's my pleasure to bring up Christine Perret from Perret Research and Consulting. She'll talk about AR interoperability and standards.
Thank you, Dane. Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to see so many of you, familiar faces and new faces. As Dane said, I'm an independent researcher, and I've been focusing on interoperability and standards now for, well, longer than you need to know. My goal is to tell you about what's happening and how you can get involved. But, you know, I'm going to go so fast that, you know, buckle your seatbelts here because I have 48 slides in 20 minutes. So to give you an idea, the man at the back asked me, do you have any video? And I said, yes, my slides. So just think of these as a slow motion video and I'm the narrator. All right, so what we're going to talk about really quickly is why you should care about interoperability for augmented reality. And of course, you already do. That's why you're in this room. And then a few of the tools that we have for achieving interoperability. I'll get on with a status update, just some highlights, and then how you can get involved. As Ori said this morning, there's a lot of companies in this ecosystem. I could have put up more logos, but I thought this picture did the trick for me. These are not the only companies, and I think there's approximately 500 companies. So that's a pretty rich ecosystem, and it's growing all the time. And it's composed of some different kinds of stakeholders. These are not the ecosystem segments. They're stakeholders. So there are people who make hardware and components. There's, of course, the customer. Maybe I should have started by the customer. The customer is the most important. And those are the ones who make the purchasing decisions on behalf of end users. There's the integrators and developers in the middle of this picture, and the systems and platforms providers. And of course, they all would like to be your only supplier, but we know in the real world that can't be the case. In fact, we need interoperability because we need for AR enabling components, systems, software, everything, services, all of it, to seamlessly communicate and exchange data so that users can have AR experiences when they need them and where they need them reliably every time without worrying about translations and conversions and delays that could introduce latency and artifacts in the experience of the user. So those ecosystem stakeholders all have issues. They all have things they want to do. And with interoperability, we can make the market grow faster. The components can get to market more quickly. They can be more diversified. They can solve a very specific problem. The problems that the customers, these customers and end users have. And so the customers can assemble unique solutions for their specific problems. And then the providers can compete on implementation, not on price. And speaking of price, interoperability over the long run has the tendency to reduce the cost of developing and delivering components by driving volume. So how do we get there? Interoperability, it has many, many forms. I'm just giving you some of the basic terminology, but there are 3 ways that I study for how to achieve interoperability, and they are to have open standards, and I'll get into much more detail about those. But before I do, I also want to talk about open source projects and industry groups, industry associations, communities that drive requirements. So just to give you some examples, these are the communities and organizations that I personally follow as an expert in enterprise augmented reality. There are probably 2, 3, 4 times as many communities that you could look to help us define and improve requirements, the clarity of the requirements. Another piece of terminology. This is a slide developed by Neil Trevitt for the Khronos group. And so there's sometimes a lack of clarity between what is an open standard and what is an open source software solution. As this slide shows, a standard is something that has been specified by a community. It gives advantage to the implementation, to those who implement the standard well or best. Open source happens when many people get together and implement software, and then they can have industry consensus, and they might have other advantages, but there's no competitive advantage in the implementation itself. So each of these can have some drawbacks, and that's why when you're facing an interoperability problem, you need to choose carefully how you approach and with whom you approach these problems. Rather than telling you about all the open source projects I've ever seen or the ones that are currently active, I'd prefer that you go to this webpage that I developed as part of an ISMAR 2021 tutorial, and then you can find a list of, I think there's 10 or 12 different open source projects that are highly relevant, and there's more information and lots of links there that will take you to more information. So that's kind of a snapshot of open source and what I think of and what I'm monitoring, and what I recommend that you monitor as well. Now let's come to standards, another one of Neil's slides. Standards are critical to making technology pervasive. We've proven that over and over again. We proved it in the electrical grid, and then 30 or 40 years ago, we proved it again with personal computing, and the interoperability that came through the collaboration of many different groups and standards organizations, and there were many. And finally, today we're facing a new challenge, and AR interoperability is going to be more than just a few standards. AR interoperability is going to require a constellation of standards. So what standards? I personally track about 25 different standards working groups. That's not to say that you need to do that, but that is what I invest in order to be able to understand what each of those is doing. And you can, I'll give you a page at the end, a URL you can go to that I'll maintain that page with lots of different standards and what they're doing. So now let's race through, and I mean really fast, a few of those SDOs and what they're doing. You may have heard about, the W3C activities in XR. So this standard started quite a few years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And it's the WebXR device API, and they are quite far along in this, and it's mainly focusing on VR capabilities, but there will be the core sets of features that can be used for AR. In fact, there is something called the AR module, and it has some different features you can see here that are not necessarily critical for virtual reality, but they are for augmented reality. And so each one of these modules or these features within the module is in the process of being developed slowly. So there are here some of the links to editor's drafts, and that's what we call a preliminary specification, something that's in draft mode. There's also devices and sensors working group within the W3C, and you probably are already familiar with that with your work with AR and VR, that the geolocation and other sensor interfaces. There's also the Web of Things. This is also about the same maturity level as the WebXR specification. It's highly complicated, and there's some really, really good work happening in this area, highly relevant to augmented reality, and you may not be tracking that right yet, but I hope you will in the future. So those are just a few of the W3C standards that are actively being developed and that are relevant to AR. Let's turn our attention to the Khronos group. The Khronos group has another suite of standards, and I really like the way this slide shares how there are standards that pertain to 3D assets, inputs, outputs, and hardware. And many of you may have attended the OpenXR session a few hours ago, and you would have learned that there's a lot of work going on. I'm just going to share with you a little bit about the OpenXR and the GLTF and 3D commerce. So the OpenXR, again, there was a session already about that, is getting a lot of adoption. It's they're doing extensions to that, and there's really a high value here to provide cross-platform, high-performance VR and AR experiences, and they create an abstraction layer above the hardware. The other very, very important standard the Khronos group is working on is called GLTF. It's a transmission format for 3D assets. Think of it as the JPEG version for 3D assets. And it's been evolving, and again here, a very, very large group of important players, adopters, and implementers are participating and collaborating in the Khronos group on GLTF. They have been working on, in the last 12 months, a lot of these extensions for different materials. And that's fantastic for augmented reality. The more that we can use the hardware to make graphics more realistic and integrate more with the real world, the better it will be, and the easier and less expensive it will be for those who are creating content for AR. There's also in the Khronos group the 3D Commerce working group. So this is focusing, as the name implies, on on products that are designed in one atmosphere or one setting for sale on the web or in virtual sales rooms, 3D perhaps. And they want to be able to reuse the same models in many, many different catalogs and different devices and different types of browsers. What I find exciting about the work of the 3D Commerce Working Group is it's not developing a specification for interoperability. They're really focusing on best practices, guidelines, and then validating and certifying tools that will comply with many of the Khronos Group standards. So this is really leveraging, think of it as an umbrella. It's on top of other lower level Khronos Group activity. A third standards development organization is called the Open Geospatial Consortium. They rebranded themselves on, last Friday or Monday, so I didn't have a chance to update this branding. There are somewhere on the order of 10, maybe even more different standards working groups within the Open Geospatial Consortium that are relevant, depending on your use case. The one on which I've been working on is called GeoPose, and it is a way of encoding a pose in a geospatially referenced way so that you can exchange poses, and they're always going to be anchored on the physical world, so on the Earth. So it's a topographic-centric reference frame. If you just want the short version, GeoPose is a way of getting the location and orientation of anything. So I say everything has a GeoPose. Anything spatial, and the orientation and location of everything relative to the Earth's surface. So you can now express, record, share the position and orientation of objects. So right now we're working on a reviewer's guide. We have had it out in the open. If you would like to look at that, you can go to the GitHub repo. We have a public review for comments currently open for another 10 days or a week. And we hope that you'll learn more about that because it's very fundamental. A couple of other standards within the OGC. One is called Indoor Mapping Data Format. This was developed by Apple. It went through a different process than other standards. It went through the process of being contributed by one member of the ecosystem, reviewed by the OGC, and approved and voted in. So that's a different approach. We also are working on the Points of Interest I also am active in the Points of Interest working group, and it's quite early days, but you'll be hearing more about that in the future. The fourth and final standards development organization I'll speak about is ETSI Industry Specification Group for AR Framework. About a year and a half ago, we delivered this framework describing components. This summer, we released a set of requirements for world storage, world referencing, and I think this is highly relevant to the metaverse and to world maps, about which we've heard a great deal so far this morning and today, and we will be hearing more in the future. I am the rapporteur on this particular report. It is the set of requirements for real-world capture, analysis, and scene management requirements. So look for that. These are all publicly available, and we invite your comment. The ETSI is now working towards doing some implementation-driven standards. I don't have time to talk about this right now, but it is something that's happening, and that's going to be very important going forward. So the fifth standards group, the Standards Development Organization, the IEEE, very, very important globally, many hundreds of, thousands of standards, but you could even say hundreds of them are relevant to AR, but we'll let that pass. This is a new group within the IEEE, the Spatial Web Protocol, Architecture, and Governance. On the topic of governance, you can see on the slide the scope of it. It's, again, very ambitious, very large in scope, and highly relevant to everything that we've been hearing about today and that we'll be hearing over the next few days. It is a joint activity with the Spatial Web Foundation, and there's a contribution that's going to be presented to the working group in coming days. That contribution is to be submitted to the working group and will then be developed over the coming months as part of using the IEEE process. Other IEEE standards include the ARLM, the AR Learning Experience Model. It's been out now for about 2 years. And there's just an unending number of standards. I invite you to go to this page. I've listed, I believe, 45 standards activities that I'm aware of, and so certainly you could go there. You could also go to the agenda page. You can download the slides that we presented during this tutorial and watch a video that's more detailed but covers a lot of the same ground. So this is the tutorial video. It's available on YouTube, and I invite you to go and check that out. What should you be doing, and what is going to be happening in the future? As I said at the beginning, AR interoperability will require a constellation of standards, and we recognized that a long time ago. And that's why in 2010, we started a community that focused on getting discussions going between different standards development organizations. We held quarterly meetings. It was highly productive. And unfortunately, people got busy doing other things. And as a result, there's been far less coordination between standards bodies. And this brings up some pretty significant risks. There's already examples I'm aware of duplication of effort. But probably the biggest risk is that people will get turned off to standards because they'll say, oh, there's so many standards and they don't interoperate. Well, they don't address the same challenges. So it's really important to understand what is the goal of a standard, and then I think we do have to increase the coordination efforts. We have some strategies to reduce those risks that I mentioned a few minutes ago. We should definitely have people who participate in multiple standards organizations so that there's this crosstalk and sharing of information and liaison agreements. All of these things will produce more engagement and participation in the standardization process and the validation of standards. One of the standards development groups that has really led the charge and done a lot in this domain is the Khronos group. There's a lot of cooperation between Khronos and other standards groups that you see on this screen, standards groups and industry associations. But what if you're not a standards development organization? What if you're just a customer or a provider of technologies and you'd like to get started, the first thing you need to do is take stock of what's around you. Get a handle on your landscape internally to your company. Who cares about interoperability? And for what reason? We need to make sure that we know who the stakeholders are and what their issues are and their requirements. If you, once you have that, if you are a customer of augmented reality solutions or services, then you need to get your requirements into the standards development organization. You could build validation systems to test interoperability or to test compliance with a standard. You could join the working group meetings and participate. You could write feedback and give review to draft specifications. And of course, we all need you to speak loudly and clearly about interoperability and the different ways of addressing that going forward. If you are a provider of solutions, you can do many of the same things. And if you're a non-commercial entity, a research organization or a government agency of some kind, you also have a responsibility to participate and contribute to this process. So those are the statements, prepared remarks I had. I didn't mention that I'm one of the founders of the AREA, the AR for Enterprise Alliance. The AREA has a program which I lead about interoperability and standards, so we focus on the interoperability and needs of enterprises. And we're going to have a gathering tomorrow morning before the keynote, coffee and pastries and so forth, and we invite you to join us. It is upstairs in the Great America Meeting Room, so that's on the other side of the exhibits hall, down the path, way down there, up the escalators, and you'll find those meeting rooms there. I think you'll be seeing those later this evening. All right, so I think that that does it for me. Does anybody have any questions? Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, round of applause, please. Thank you, Christine.
I just wanted to ask about, I guess, the need for both 2D and 3D to play nicely together. Do you know of any standards that are working on something like that, where right now you have things like Unity and you have a bunch of 2D tools, but there's not a standard for how those will come together that I know of?
One of the ways that I've seen this addressed is by simplifying your question a little bit and saying everything is 3D. It's just that in some cases the axis is 0, or one of the axes is 0. And so everything is 3D, and sometimes it's represented in 2 or 2.5 dimensions. But I'm not studying any specific work that is at that intersection. That in general, the AR standards and the activities that I'm monitoring assume that our world is 3D and will remain so, and that these two-dimensional screens that we hold and love dearly and hate are going to be replaced, and there's room for text and images, and those will just be integrated and accepted in a 3D world. But I think that I've seen, for example, in the ARML 2.0, a very, very early standard that the OGC worked on, there was a sense of specifying how an image or a frame of text could be turned with respect to the user so that they would see that it's two-dimensional, but still having that perspective. I hope that helps.
One quick standards question for you. From the outside looking in as a developer, it seems like Khronos' WebGL and W3C's WebGPU are starting to kind of diverge and create conflict, which is frustrating for end users. What are your thoughts on this?
I think that you're speaking to a very important issue around the risks and the consequences of overlapping efforts. And eventually, I think the market will decide how and where to best use one or the other. So it is unfortunate, but it is an example of where there was perhaps a low desire or a low investment in coordinating the activities. So it's a good example of what happens when multiple standards organizations try to address the same requirements. And the market will play out and will decide. There's Neil Trevitt, who can answer that question better than I can. So Neil Trevitt is the president of the Khronos Group.
Yep, thank you. Mask here. Good, great question. Not quite how it happened. Khronos is working with W3C to support WebGPU. It is a big transition because just like the native APIs are transitioning from the old style GL to the new style DX12 Vulkan, it's going to be a transition for developers. But the WebGL was kind of weird because Khronos did the web standards, building over our OpenGL. And actually, I think it's a better fit that WebGPU is being done at the W3C and is building over the Khronos native APIs like Vulkan and SpearV. That's actually a better way to do it. So we're actually working with the W3C and we're doing everything we can to make sure it's a smooth transition for developers from WebGL 2, which is now universal. It's on Apple and will be probably the main API for several years to come. But we're looking forward to helping everyone transition to WebGPU.
Awesome, thank you.
That's what happens when you collaborate.
We have 2 more questions here.
Hi again. You mentioned the standards for encoding geospatial pose and indoor pose. Are you aware of any standards for encoding the relationship of content to physical things? So if I wanted to have something that had an encoded orientation relative to like a person or a chair, something like that.
To my knowledge, there isn't a specification for how to encode that relationship between the digital asset and the physical target or anchor. There are a few that are under development. There's, to some degree, that is being described in the spatial web working group, and the hyperspace modeling language will have components of that. The ETSI ISG framework also has defined that connection between the digital and the physical as an area for standardization. The ETSI ISG has not itself developed standards for that, but we are that's the implementation-driven standards development process that I mentioned just very briefly. There's an example of where the developers are creating an open source implementation of how one might universally attach content to the same physical object using different authoring environments and different players or browsers for AR. So that is being funded and supported highly by ETSI as a parent organization. I think it's a very exciting approach. However, most of these things, it's really a matter of adoption. And the goal is always to be adopted. If you don't have all of the right players in the process as it's being developed, there's a lower likelihood that you will have adoption. So that's a delicate way of stating it. There are attempts.
Quick question on maybe not so quick, but how do you think that these standards are going to impact, let's say, the end users, the industries who are adopting AR? And I'll say that's twofold, right? You know, maybe some companies are in their pilot stages where they can shift technology, and maybe some have already scaled AR, as we've seen here, or they've implemented, picked a hardware and a software, and they're invested. How do these standards affect those two kind of use cases there?
So I think one of the most important benefits of standards is to give the customer choices about all the components that they could integrate into their AR solution. So one of the problems is that every industry, vertical industry, has its own internal standards and regulations that they have to honor and continue to evolve in real time, so they're always adapting to those. So I think what I've been talking about are entirely or exclusively horizontal enabling layers. And the question you're asking, if I'm not mistaken, is how do those intersect with the vertical industry-specific standards? And you see that happening in things like the ASME, automotive industry standards, aviation, transportation, mining, oil. So there are standards in those cases, and they can create profiles of standards that will be, it's not always called that, but they can create specific versions that they want their industry to implement. And we do see examples of that. In my experience, for example, we have the spatial reference model. It's been used in simulation. It's all over the DoD. And they are doing a special profile using GeoPose just so that you can add that into simulations. So there's both the cases where an industry standard may refer to a horizontal standard in a normative way. That means it requires it. And there's also examples in which people who have adopted implementation or implemented horizontal enabling standards can make a solution, a specific industry solution that's targeting the problems of healthcare or construction or something like that, and they'll get an advantage because of that implementation. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Christine. Can I get a round of applause for Christine, please?
Thank you, Dane.